Welcome to the Education Scotland podcast. In every episode, we are joined by teachers, professionals and experts to unpack some of the big questions and topics facing the education sector in Scotland. Stay informed with the latest on education in Scotland by subscribing to our podcast.
Hello everyone and welcome to the Education Scotland podcast. My name's Ollie Bray and I'm one of the Strategic Directors here at Education Scotland, and today I'm delighted to be joined by my colleague Andy Creamer, who's the Head of Learning and Teaching Assessment here at Education Scotland. So welcome, Andy.
Thank you, Ollie.
And we're going to be talking about the curriculum improvement cycle, which hopefully folks that have tuned in know is the systematic review of the Scottish curriculum, and Andy is involved in many aspects of this work, but I think probably you would say, Andy, one of the main bits that you've just been leading recently has been the review of the curriculum areas, which is obviously a massive part of the curriculum as we go forward. And again, as people might already know, we've been producing a number of documents that have been setting out a case for change, and also some work on a new technical framework as we aim to set out a clear and coherent plan for the summer term 2025. So the idea of this podcast really is to talk through the first one of these documents, which Education Scotland produced in November 2024 around that, and it's called Background and a Case for Change. We've both got copies of it here around us to remind ourselves what's in it. But Andy, just for the folks that haven't read it yet, if you were to describe in a couple of sentences what the purpose of this document was, how would you describe that?
Well, I suppose, Ollie, the key thing with this paper was really the findings from the pilot curriculum reviews that Education Scotland carried out between February 2023 and March 2024, and really focusing on two key aspects, which were what were these pilots telling us about the process for reviewing the curriculum, but also what were some of the key messages about the current curriculum and what the nature of a future-orientated curriculum would look like.
And I think, I know it feels like we've talked a lot about this before, but I've always thought the idea of a pilot was a really, really interesting one, because I think that the way that Education Scotland might have worked in the past might have been just to come up with a methodology and go and do it, like rather than trying different things out with different curriculum areas, with different sectors, to sort of try and find out what's best as well. You described this a lot better than me, but what were some of the reactions from some of the folks that were involved in the pilots around that?
I think one of the key things that we found out right from the very first pilot was the high levels of engagement, enthusiasm and motivation from participants. I think in particular teachers appreciated the headspace. They appreciated the opportunity to engage in dialogue with fellow practitioners from the same sector, from different sectors, but also with key stakeholders, employers and academics in particular. And we've had some really strong feedback and really positive feedback about the engagement in the process, and also the high numbers of people who have basically signed up to take part in the various pilots and now the curriculum improvement cycle work itself.
So I want to talk a little bit about the types of pilots in a minute, and the amount of people that have been involved. But I suppose just from a personal reflection, having stuck my head into a few of the pilots, the buzz in the room was just fantastic. Around that, people genuinely did seem to be engaged. So before I ask you about the nature of the pilots and what took place as part of that process, it's probably just worth reminding the folks that are either listening in or watching on YouTube the model that you were involved in around the actual curriculum improvement cycle itself, around that, because again we used co-design approaches to help develop that. We worked with the OECD to look at how different countries around the world review their curriculum. Yep. But I think most importantly, the model that we developed isn't something that we've retrofitted from another system. It's something that we've developed from Scotland, and we thought that was really, really important. And again, just to remind people, if you've not seen this information, is that we think that the systematic review of the Scottish curriculum will take about 10 years. We think we've got kind of 4 stages as part of that. We've got an analysing stage. It's really, really important that everything is based on evidence. We've got a stage then when we're engaging and we're co-creating, and we'll pick up a little bit more on that in a second, because the model used for the pilot curriculum reviews I think was special and unique as part of that as well. Then we would move into a sharing and learning and adopting stage, a realisation stage, we might have called that previously. And then, of course, we would want to be able to monitor and evaluate the impact as well. And we would hope, if it's going to be a systematic review and it's going to have more than one cycle, that would then lead into the first part of it. And the reason I wanted to mention that, and the reason I think that's important, is because I know that as we now move into the actual cycle of the curriculum review, we've got this overall review cycle: analyse, engage, share, and evaluate. But each of the individual curriculum areas will also follow that as well around that. So Andy, can you tell us then about the pilot curriculum reviews? What were the subject areas that were involved, and when did they take place?
Okay, we started off initially with maths, health and wellbeing, and social studies in a first phase from February 2023 up until the summer. They involved deliberately quite different approaches, because we were piloting different approaches, we were trialling out. So we looked at different ways of engaging practitioners who would be involved, who would be recruited, the types of activities that would be involved in, the methodologies that we'd use, and also just focusing on how we would engage people, whether it was, for example, face-to-face or whether it was online.
Any things that came out there that maybe didn't surprise you, but any sort of strong messages coming out about the actual kind of process around that?
I think it's really important as face-to-face. I think we found out in the very one of the first phase pilots that when you try and do it online, you don't have the same level of dialogue, the same level of discussion, the in-depth opportunity to discuss with practitioners and stakeholders across a range of different backgrounds. So I think it's really important. That in itself presents some challenges. So how do you release staff from school to take part in these? But I think what we've found is that the high level of engagement, the high level of motivation, I think the messages that have percolated across the system have helped encourage other people to be involved. And we've also looked at different ways of recruiting. I think what we've settled on as a result of the pilots was an approach to recruitment which was open. It was an opportunity for participants to sign up via advertising on social media through existing networks and so on, and but then topping up to ensure we had a proper representation, so we included all the perspectives that are important in the review process.
And I know that's something that in particular you've been really hot on, making sure that we've got all parts of Scotland that are represented, making sure that all sectors are representative as part of that, having a combination of people that have come into the profession that are fairly new, as well as people that have been teaching for a long time, so they've got that wisdom as well. That just the differences of perspectives, I think, has been really important.
No, and I think that is a really important aspect, to bring in those different perspectives. I think sometimes in one of the phrases that we used in feedback from one of the collaboration group meetings was about the quiet voices and ensuring that everybody's voice is represented, and we're including all perspectives.
And I think what you said about quiet voices is really important, because we've all been on those Teams calls, haven't you? And you're should I say this, is that you're on the Teams call and you're answering your email, you're doing 2 or 3 things, but actually you become that quiet voice around that, whereas actually in a face-to-face event there are less places to hide around that as well, which is part of the process. Just one thing, I think, before we move on, because I'm interested to sort of hear some of the themes that rise to the surface. But we've already mentioned a little bit as part of the cycle that notion of kind of co-design, and you talked a little bit about, as part of the pilots, you tried different exercises out to sort of try and find out work. I mean, I'm guessing there'll be a few people listening that don't know what co-design is or what service design is. Can you say a few words on that, just in terms of what we mean?
Yeah, well, I think across Scottish Government there's a commitment to service design approaches, which is really taking into account the views and the perspectives of, if you like, our customer base, and the different perspectives. We trialled out a variety of different approaches based on service design and evidence-based approaches, and that's helped shape the approaches that we've taken as we've moved in from the pilots into the formal curriculum improvement cycle work.
And I think again, hopefully you would agree on this, is that one of the purposes of using the service design as well is that the ideas come from the service users. And in Education in Scotland, I think we see ourselves as the facilitators in this process around that. And one thing that we haven't mentioned as part of the model, we've talked about the different representation, but one thing that we're really committed to moving forward is that practitioner voice is the strongest voice in the room, and we're working towards a ratio of, whenever we've got 4 people in the room, 3 of those people will be teachers and practitioners, and that's important as we go into the next stage as well, I think.
And I think it's a really essential point that this is something that engages, that there's ownership, that isn't top-down, and it's a different way of carrying out the process of curriculum review, and I think that's contributed to the positive reaction that we've had from across the system of adopting that type of approach.
I think you're absolutely right. So we talked a little bit about testing different things out, and that was one of the roles of the pilots. Of course, one of the other roles of the pilots was to think about the position of knowledge. That was a challenge that was given us from the OECD in 2021. So we'll maybe come on to that in a minute.
Okay.
But what about other things? What other things, like if you've got, over 500 people have been involved in the pilots, perhaps more than that. By the time that we got to the end. At different levels, as we said, because we're trying different things out, different approaches. But what were some of the things that were rising to the surfaces around the tensions that were coming that probably would describe as being common across all curriculum areas?
Okay. I think there was an overall message that we need to declutter the curriculum. If you go back to the OECD report, which was, if you like, the instigator of the pilots, I think there was a reference to a mile wide, inch deep. It was something that came out from the very first day of the first pilot, and was replicated across the reviews, and a real focus on concentrating on depth of learning and understanding. It presented challenges. We considered as part of the pilots what that would look like. How do you declutter the curriculum? I think a lot of teachers in the pilots had ideas of what needed to go into the curriculum to future orientate it, but maybe a bit more difficult about how do you create the space for some of those ideas, and what do you deprioritise as part of the process. So the need to have some clear parameters for the process of decluttering and focusing on what's important.
And anything else sort of coming through with the different things?
Yeah, I think there were some really strong messages. Some of the things that I've referred to previously as structural challenges. So, for example, disconnect between the BG and the senior phase. Some challenges with transition, particularly from primary to secondary, but also as we go through the process of reviewing and updating the curriculum to ensure that we recognise the differences between curriculum areas. So, for example, maths and the structured knowledge within maths isn't going to be the same as expressive arts. So having flexibility within an evolving curriculum framework to recognise those differences. I think there was also some key messages regarding the position across curricular areas. So, for example, the responsibility fall and national entitlements, and maybe those were seen as being either ineffective or inconsistent, and the need to address those as part of a review and a refresh and update of the curriculum.
And I imagine, as well as looking at and recognising the difference between curriculum areas, there was also a notion about recognising the difference between sectors, around that as well. I think that, dare I say it, one of the tensions that we have within CFE is it's a kind of one size fits all, isn't it, around that? So thinking about that. And then I like what you're saying about the cross-curriculum areas, because if I think about the different policy interventions that we've had, say, in the last decade, we've had things on creativity, employability, entrepreneurship, and that just adds, I suppose, to the clustering of the curriculum in a non-sensitive way. Yeah.
No, and I think that's a really important point. That I think one of the messages that we've got is the need to redefine the relationship between these cross-curricular areas and the curriculum areas. One of the really early messages that came out in the very first pilot review in maths was about the significance of, for example, financial literacy as being a key feature of a future-orientated curriculum, and about trying to have something that embeds these cross-curricular areas in the curriculum, so they're not seen as an add-on but are integral to the curriculum.
It's interesting you say financial, education around that financial literacy. I was reading something just earlier in the week, is that this is almost like the number one priority now for a lot of kids around the world because of a variety of different reasons. So important, really. I've got to ask you this question about guidance around that. First of all, because I know one of the things that you sort of mentioned in the paper is nobody wants more guidance, around that. So, what were your sort of thoughts, on that? What were people saying? And I think being as tongue-in-cheek as you like.
I think it was a very strong message that practitioners are looking for greater clarity, but also flexibility. But again, recognising some of the comments in the additional OECD report, ensuring we provide that clarity without providing additional guidance. I think a phrase that's resonated is guidance in place of, not in addition to.
Yeah.
So trying to provide that clarity, particularly on the position of knowledge within the curriculum, but in doing so in a practical and meaningful way that doesn't provide more and more documentation.
Yeah, and that leads us then nicely into the kind of the next section of the report, really, around that, because I suppose, you know, one way that you might remove some of the current tensions that we have with the CFE would to be add more layers of guidance to it, you know, to do that. But the clear message is that people don't want that around that. So one of the kind of conclusions that you and reach in the report is this idea of going back and revisiting what we call a technical framework. And again, you know, when we think about the technical framework of the curriculum, this is the important part. Is we're thinking about the materials that teachers and practitioners currently use to plan learning. So in Scotland, that would currently be mainly the experiences and outcomes, the benchmarks, local approaches to moderation, and local progression frameworks. You know, around that as well. And we've talked a little bit about the OECD report and the work here, but again, I was also struck, and I think I mentioned this when Gillian Hamilton was interviewing me about the curriculum improvement cycle, is that message came through as well from the national discussion, led by Professor Elmer Harris, Professor Carol Campbell, and they say, and I'm just quoting from this, as part of the review of the curriculum, the technical framework of the BG, including the experience and outcomes, need to be visited to ensure, you know, it's still fit for purpose, you know, around that. So, could you? I mean, if we're going into a direction, I know the second paper is around evolving the technical framework, but as part of the work in the pilot curriculum reviews, how much did you think about that? You know, around that, because I know the work evolved, didn't it, as you went along?
I think putting in a bit of context, what seemed to be a clear message across all the pilot reviews that were carried out, and it's almost like imagining we're a spectrum. At one end you've got a curriculum framework that is very flexible, high level of autonomy. At the other end, a very prescriptive framework. And I think a view that CFE, as part of a competency-based approach, was towards the high autonomy, high flexibility. But what I think was coming out was to provide greater clarity and move in a bit to provide greater clarity, but definitely not moving over towards a highly prescribed framework. We looked at what that would look like during the course of the pilots. There was discussions that considered, well, do we need to look at an additional framework clarifying the position of knowledge? Do we need to pull together, for example, the E's and O's, the benchmarks, progression frameworks, and so on? I think everybody thought there was weaknesses with both, and I think what was starting to emerge even from that first pilot in some follow-up meetings was actually we need to look at an alternative technical framework, because the technical framework itself, I think, has flagged up significant challenges and structural barriers. So I think what came out was a real openness and willingness, and a view that actually by addressing the technical framework we could maybe address some of the maybe longer term issues that have been flagged up regarding the curriculum.
And of course, that's one of the big conclusions of the paper, isn't it? Is that we need to have a look at the current technical framework and make sure it's still fit for purpose. Around that, really linking into the findings from the work that you've been involved in, being triangulated, if you like, by the OECD and the work from the national discussion on that. I always think that the position of knowledge is an interesting one, you know, in this, because I think that sometimes people think that knowledge wasn't part of CFE, and of course it was. But you've said an interesting thing there, and I think the word that you used was clarify. You know, so how do we clarify, you know, the position of knowledge about that, so that people have got like more clarity in terms of what young people need to know, need to do, you know, as a result of that. Any thoughts on knowledge?
No, I think some of the early messages, and one really consistent point that came out across the reviews was that because autonomy has evolved at a school level for developing the curriculum, there was decisions made at a school level on the knowledge that learners should have. That seemed to be contributing to a challenge, particularly with transition from primary to secondary, where I think when learners were coming, for example, from different feeder primary schools, they weren't coming with a common base or a consistent base of knowledge, and that posed particular challenges for secondary practitioners to try and develop or create that common base. And I think providing greater clarity clarity on the knowledge we would expect learners to have, but also point out that knowledge isn't the same as content. I've used an example quite a few times that we wanted learners to know, for instance, I come from a social subjects background, that external groups have had an impact on the development of your society's culture. Down in the borders, that might be looking at the Romans. Up in Peterhead, that might be looking at the Vikings in the West Coast. It might be looking at the impact of Irish immigration. So there are different contexts, different content, but you've still got the same basic knowledge that you have about an external group having an impact on the development of your society's culture. So I think it is trying to provide that greater clarity, but still enabling the flexibility for teachers to develop the curriculum based on the learners that are in front of them, based on their local communities, based on the learners that they know. And that was also a really key message that came out across the pilots, that practitioners in particular did not want a highly prescriptive framework that specified the knowledge that learners should have. They should be able to develop the curriculum based on the learners that they know and that they know best.
And you summed it up beautifully around that notion of clarity with flexibility. Around that sums it up perfectly, almost in a sentence. Andy, that's been a brilliant conversation, really, and I hope that we've whetted the appetites, I suppose, for some people to go away now and to sort of download the paper and read it in a bit more detail around that. I suppose we just sort of recap the conclusions of the paper, if that's all right, just to sort of go through, because again, this might help people understand the work and just sort of reframe a little bit with what we've been doing there. So, in the conclusions to the paper, which again I think are fascinating, you've got 10 conclusions in here. We talk about making sure that we recruit people in an open fashion. We talk about making sure we've got a variety of perspectives from education at all levels around that. We make sure that we're cognizant of some of the practical challenges, including releasing staff. I know you've talked a little bit about there. There's a bit about guidance around that, and I'm smiling if you can see that there, because the guidance has got to provide clarity and simplify the process of it, and not actually make it even more cumbersome as a result of that. That when we think about the E's and O's, there's a strong feeling around kind of the vagueness, around those, and that needs to be addressed, and that could probably help with the current disconnect that we sometimes find between the broad general education and the senior phase around that. Massive strong desire from educators to declutter the curriculum, clarify that position of knowledge, and then the nuanced needs between sectors and different curriculum areas as well on that. We talked a little bit about the cross-curricular knowledge and skills that young people need, and the position, if you like, of cross-curriculum themes and how that comes together. And then I suppose one of the conclusions that we reached to is that rather than adding an additional layer of complications on top of the technical framework we've already got, why don't we get back to the root cause of some of these tensions and think about how do we evolve the technical framework as we move forward from there.
And I think a key message that came out, I think a general aspiration from across the pilots was, because we've got an opportunity now to address some of these issues that I think have been underline the curriculum, and it's an opportunity now as we go through into the curriculum improvement cycle to address these issues and to resolve some of the tensions that came up as a result of the pilots.
And that's a really good sort of place, I think, to sort of finish around that, because of course one of the second paper that was published in December 2024, which will be the subject of a separate podcast, looks at how we might evolve that and move that forward. Andy, thanks for your time around that.
Okay,
I enjoyed the conversation as always feel I learn a lot from whenever I sort of sit down and speak to you. I suppose the only thing that would just be to kind of say is that that if folks are interested in learning more about the curriculum improvement cycle, we've got a website, scotlandscurriculum.scot. You can find some of the ongoing work there, the story of the cycle there, and also a collection of resources that we're putting together. But Andy, that's great. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. Don't forget to subscribe for notification of when a new episode is published. If there is a topic you would like to hear featured on this podcast, get in touch with us. We'd love to hear from you. Follow us on our social media channels for all the latest news from Education Scotland. Education Scotland is a Scottish Government executive agency charged with supporting quality and improvement in Scottish education.